Okay, Nate, today you wanted to talk about revolution and I guess when is force or violence acceptable?
Yeah, well, I've thought about revolution a lot, and fundamentally, I absolutely do believe that oppressed groups have the right to use violence. Um, and the example of that is, the Jews were oppressed so heavily they have the right to use violence against the Nazis, or slaves are oppressed so heavily with their whole lives and freedoms taken from them that they have the right to use violence against their slave masters. But I draw some pretty clear lines on when I think oppression is extreme enough to justify revolution and violence, because preferably we wouldn't have a revolution, because revolution involves killing a lot of people. Now, preferably we shouldn't be killing anyone, so we don't really want to have a violent revolution if we can avoid it, because it involves going around and slaughtering a lot of people, which is really terrible. I'm a pacifist, I don't believe in doing that. So my thinking is, first of all, in a democratic nation where there is room for reform, where people have right to input in the political process and there is the option to campaign and lobby for reform in society, we should always preferably choose to lobby and campaign for reform through democratic process rather than just running through and massacring a bunch of people and taking over the government. We have the democratic right to input in the government, so we should reform the government before we should use violence in revolution. Now, outside of that, when there is an oppressive regime who are claiming ownership of a country and dominating a country and aren't elected, I do believe in ousting regimes that aren't elected, because they're claiming ownership of others and they're coming in and they're forcing their regime onto a population, and nullifying the population's right to any input or choice in the governance of their population. So I believe populations have a right to input in how their population is governed, and when there is a totalitarian regime or a regime that is just forcing its will on the public, on the people of the population, I believe in that instance violent revolution is justified. But I want to be clear about when I think oppression is heavy enough that we should fight back with violence. As I said, we should always, preferably in the democratic process, try and reform the system before we go around killing people. In my book, Kings of the New Age, The Quest of the Balancing Stones, just briefly I'll explain what happens. A nuclear war has happened, World War III has happened, and when World War III happened, the Australian government put generals in charge of all the different regional hubs and cities. Now, shortly after putting the generals in charge to maintain order in the regional hubs and cities of Australia, the Australian federal government collapsed under the pressures of economic collapse and the world falling into turmoil after the nuclear war. After the government collapsed, a despot military man named Bruce organised all the gangs, street gangs in Newcastle to overthrow the general who was placed in charge by the government, and then he overthrew that general and took control of Newcastle. And since taking control of Newcastle, he has forced the entire population of the region into slavery to work building fortifications. Essentially, General Bruce has got the citizens of Newcastle working as slaves, building a castle out of the city of Newcastle, building huge walls around the city, building huge guard towers and fortifications all around the city. So post-nuclear war, the government has collapsed. General Bruce has overthrown the person in charge of the region and has forced all of the population of Newcastle into terrible slavery to work to build his castle. And they're not just working, he's also torturing people, and if anyone disagrees, they get executed. If you disagree with General Bruce's regime, they just drag you and they shoot you in front of everyone to make sure that everyone sees what happens to dissenters. And there's also a scene, because at the worksite they have crucifixes where if anyone disagrees with the regime on the worksite, they get strung up on the crucifix and then they get stoned to death. And there's a scene in the 3rd chapter of my book, where they're all at the worksite building the fortifications as slaves, and one man dissents. He gets angry at the guards, the King's gang, and he spits at them and argues. Then General Bruce turns up in a tank and says, string him up, and the King's gang take him and they put him on the crucifix, and they tie him to the crucifix, and they order all the other slaves at gunpoint to stone the man to death, and everyone is forced to stone this man to death. Now that's extreme violent oppression. Now that's why in my book, Kings of the New Age, The Quest of the Balancing Stones, the people of Newcastle, in my mind, absolutely have the right to use violence against General Bruce's regime for a number of reasons. First of all, General Bruce wasn't elected by the people of Newcastle. He overthrew an assigned leader who the federal government had assigned. He overthrew him and stole control with an organised gang that he organised from street gangs. So he's not a legitimate leader. He's not appointed by any authority or through democratic process. And second of all, General Bruce is inflicting torture and violence on the community and forcing them to work as slaves, and if they disagree, they get executed. So in my book, Kings of the New Age, The Quest of the Balancing Stones, the oppression is so extreme and so violent, because the King's gang, they're almost like a fascist Nazi gang. They're extremely violent, brutal gang. And so in my book, the oppression and the violence against the people of Newcastle is so extreme that that members of the community come together and form a coalition, and then they plan a military coup to overthrow General Bruce, and throughout the course of the book they orchestrate this elaborate plan, and basically an entire war breaks out in Newcastle, a very complicated war breaks out, and eventually they overthrow General Bruce, and then they have an election to bring back in democracy. So this scenario I have painted in Kings of the New Age, The Quest of the Balancing Stones, for me, exemplifies a situation where oppression is so severe that violence is the only option, right? So in relation to when do a group of people who aren't appointed by an authority have the right to come together and decide of their own accord that they are going to inflict violence on a regime, if you're interested in my views on when that sort of revolutionary activity is justified, read my book Kings of the New Age, The Quest of the Balancing Stones, and you will see the scenario I've painted where that sort of violent revolution is absolutely justified. So I've detailed a few things I think about when violence and violent revolution and violent action is justified. And as I've said, remember I've said that I believe that while we have the option to reform government through democratic process, we preferably should choose to reform government through democratic process, because that is the pacifist approach. We don't, no matter how much we think the world needs to change to be a better place for everyone, we shouldn't run around killing people. Preferably we shouldn't run around killing people, even unless it's really, really extreme. Unless the oppression is really extreme. And like I said at the start of the video, the Jews were persecuted so heavily by the Nazis, they absolutely had the right to resist with violence. Slaves are persecuted so heavily by their slave masters, in my mind, they absolutely have the right to resist with violence. But I think, while we have the option to reform society through democratic process, we should always avoid violent revolution, because it involves running around and killing a bunch of people, and we don't want to do that. That sort of violence doesn't really achieve much at all. So there's some of my views on when violent action is justified, when revolution is justified. So drop a comment in the comment section and tell me what you think.